Okay, I've got a jumper on, I'm on the beach, and I'm going to share with you what I think are the top 9 big issues in terms of technology and education. Of course, all of these are quite subjective in themselves, and they will be nuanced by considerations of context, experience, and wherever we're at in the current situation, whether we're in another global crisis, another pandemic, or whatever it happens to be. So these issues will be greater or lesser in terms of their importance. What I'd like you to do is watch through this and then tell me, do you agree with me? Have I missed anything? What's wrong with the arguments that I'm putting forward here? Okay, so number one, first of all, I think the biggest issue is around what you might call socio-economic factors. We can talk in terms of digital poverty, as a lot of people do, or we can paper over the cracks a little bit and talk about digital inclusion, try and frame it a little bit more positively. I tend to suggest that digital poverty is the way to see it. And what does that mean exactly? Well, it's to do with the amount of kit and connection that our students have. So, for example, we may not have students who have their own devices. They may come from households that can't afford to have any devices. They may come from households that have a weak, poor, or absent Wi-Fi connection. They may come from places where there isn't the physical space in order for them to separate themselves in order to engage with whatever is happening online. All of these things will have an impact on the way that students are able to engage. And that digital poverty is something that is an exacerbation of existing conditions that already have an impact and act as a barrier on education. So that's my number one. Number two, I think, is to do with technical capability, digital skills by another name. And this is something that not only impacts our students, of course, but also impacts the people who are offering the education. So how adequate are the skills of the people doing the teaching? You can look at any bunch of teachers in any educational setting, from primary school up to universities, and be able to say some of them are great, some of them are awful, and a whole bunch of them are in the middle somewhere. So how do you bring up the skills to at least a baseline level of all of those who are in the kind of struggling end? And what can you do to harness the innovation and the competence of the people at the front end of that? Also, though, thinking about students as well, there's a lot of lazy assumptions flying around about whether students are digital natives, to use Mark Prensky's now kind of disavowed idea that students grow up immersed in the digital, with the technology, with the screens, and somehow with an innate capacity to be able to operate and use these tools. There are two main problems with that, of course. One, it's not true. And two, just because somebody can, I don't know, play Minecraft doesn't mean that they can then operate the kit in a way that is conducive with effective education. So that's number two. Let's turn to number three. I think really this is an extension of the first two, and that is that if we shift to a position from a more traditional approach that embraces more technologies, if we are not careful, a major issue is that we are simply reinforcing and exacerbating existing structural biases in the way that those tools serve us and serve our student body. So you might see this as part of issue number one, but I think it deserves its own space, actually. We have to be really careful that our privilege, if indeed we have privilege, is not being manifested in the way that we present material and the expectations that we place on students. Just to give you one example, it's quite easy for me to have a nice, or you could argue not nice and irritating background in this video, but what about somebody who's struggling to get the connectivity, struggling with a device that won't cope with that? What if I send them a request to join a live lecture for an hour and a half? What is the impact of that? My assumptions about what I can do being something that is equivalent in terms of the abilities of my students is something that I really do need to challenge here. So it's about exacerbating existing biases. Number 4 then is to do with security, data protection, and those kinds of things. And I think that this is really fundamental, of course, in terms of the way that we're prepared to share almost every aspect of our lives online. We've got devices like uh, Alexa, Google Home, Ring, and all of these kinds of pieces of kit, part of that growing phenomenon of the Internet of Things that are intrusive and surveil us in our lives. And we welcome those kinds of things. And in many ways, we use social media, Facebook, all of these tools. We're revealing all sorts of data about ourselves. But what we don't want to be doing is to be fostering that, to encourage that, to drive more of that, and to require that in order for our students to participate and engage with the education that we're providing and the ways in which we want them to use technology. And I think it's absolutely fundamental that we skill ourselves up a little bit about the potential implications of data breaches, inappropriate data sharing, and some of the other security issues, such as the possibility of the transmission of viruses, for example, across our hardware and software and the things that we're using. Kind of linked to that, I suppose, is my 5th issue, and that is the potential that technology use has for an assault on our mental well-being. And there are lots of ways that this can impact, but just to give you 2 examples, one might be the isolating aspect of it. People talk about people on Facebook with 500 or more friends, but no real friends, as a kind of exemplification of our time, our lives, the way we are living at the moment. And that isolation can be really quite strongly exacerbated if we are using tools where we're not enabling the social aspects, the connectivity, the community building processes to really, really bed in. They kind of happen naturally in traditional face-to-face classrooms because it's such an embedded part of our cultures, universally, in fact. But online stuff, particularly remote online stuff, has less of that pedigree, less of that embedded culture, and therefore has a greater potential to isolate. And in addition to that, there are the other things which are related to security issues, I think, and that's around the possibilities of bullying, cyberbullying as it's known, or abuses through what is perceived by many of the users to be an anonymous medium. Okay, turning to my 6th issue, I think it's to do with what you might call expectation management. And here what I mean is that when people think about what a video should be like, they might, in their minds, have TikTok as their model. They might, in their minds, have Netflix as their model. They might have in their mind have a BBC documentary. And I'm not just talking about students here, I'm talking about the teachers as well. You know, a lot of teachers say to me, oh, my video is rubbish. It's terrible. I kept stalling and faltering and I don't like it. It looks awful, all these kinds of things. Well, there are things you can do. You can get a mic and you can work on your lighting, but does it have to be BBC drama quality? No, of course it doesn't. And how are we going to fulfill the obligations that we have as teachers if we're trying to mirror social media like TikTok, for example? We might tap into some of the implications of that particular favored medium at any given time, but we shouldn't be bending too much towards trying to do things in media that are not suited to our purposes. So remembering those kinds of things, I think it's a massive issue though. What do students expect when they go to school, when they go to university, when they go to college? What do they get? If there's a mismatch, they may be disappointed, even if the quality of the education is higher. So expectation management is my 6th thing. Number 7 is to do with alignment and a lack of it particularly. What I'm talking about here are some of the other issues all sort of combining our pedagogy, our curricula, the investment that we put into technology, the amount of training that we offer to people, the development of the skills necessary amongst the people delivering, the teachers, and the people receiving, the students, if you want to talk about a delivery and receiving model at all, and how there's always something, it seems, to be missing from that necessarily balanced equation. I can have all the shiny kit in the world. If nobody's trained how to use it, it will sit there like a white elephant in the room. And we really do need to think about how we're going to invest in all of those components if we're going to be successful in the way that we use technology. That's more of an argument than an issue, but I think it is an issue if you look back. I think my 8th issue is around how the possibilities of digital education are often confused, excuse me, or conflated with some of the possibilities of the digital for things like surveillance and monitoring and those kinds of things. And when it comes to educational technology, some of the bigger tools like, say, a virtual learning environment that embeds plagiarism detection software, that kind of says a lot about an institution's attitude to technology. And if that becomes the be all and end all, you're missing that sort of innovative, creative, person-centered technology approach that other institutions might be taking. And I think this is all about trust and perceptions of students and who is in charge and whether we're being driven by pedagogy or whether we're being driven by business models, neoliberalism, and all of those kinds of things. You can probably infer what I think about this. What do you think? And then finally, I think this is a really interesting one. So my 9th issue is a kind of distrust around research, or actually a lack of convincing research about the effectiveness of blended, online, hybrid, high flex technology, tools, approaches, all of this kind of stuff. Yes, it's growing, but also it's been around a lot longer than you might think. I've been using a virtual learning environment since 1997. And that's, that's 23 years. That's quite a long time, nearly a quarter of a century. So it's not that new, a lot of these things. Secondly, it's this idea that technological solutions for a lot of people are always going to be in deficit compared to live face-to-face. Well, for some people who require access from perhaps a remote situation, the technological solution might be hugely advantageous. So perceiving things as necessarily deficit, I think is really problematic. But it's that distrust in research that really is a massive issue for me, particularly in my work. I recently, just to give one example, cited some research conducted by Gua and colleagues from 2014, who looked at 7 million, nearly 7 million MOOC videos, massive open online course videos. And they established a sort of optimal viewing time for videos based on engagement data. And it's compelling and convincing. And they drew the conclusion that your video should be around 6 minutes long. And you tell that to people who are desperate to translate their practice and their ideas and their ideals and values about traditional modes of delivery, and the two don't align. And it's very difficult then for them to accept that research, where in their everyday lives, they might be saying that research should be driving everything, but perhaps when it suits as well. So it's a really difficult and problematic area. So that's 9 issues. Do you agree? Do you disagree? How do you feel? What have I missed? I look forward to hearing from you.